They built an entire neighborhood on my land and smiled like they owned it. The crunch of gravel under my boots didn't sound the same anymore as I stepped out of my truck and stared at what used to be my grandfather's 120-acre farm just outside Austin, Texas, the air thick with the smell of fresh-cut lumber and hot asphalt where there used to be nothing but open pasture and the slow, steady hum of cicadas in the summer heat, now replaced by the distant whine of power tools and the echo of kids laughing as they rode bikes down streets that didn't exist 6 months ago. Streets that cut straight through the land my family had worked for 3 generations, and right there at the entrance stood a polished stone sign that read Hollow Creek Estates like it had always belonged, like my name had been erased from the dirt itself, and I remember standing there, keys still in my hand, feeling the sun hit the back of my neck while something colder settled in my chest, because I knew this wasn't a mistake, this was planned, every inch of it. Every permit, every fence post, every smiling face that waved at me like I was just another visitor passing through, and then I saw her, Margaret Holloway, stepping out of a white Lexus SUV like she was stepping onto a stage, heels clicking against the pavement that used to be my soil, that same syrup-sweet smile I'd heard about from neighbors who suddenly stopped returning my calls, and she looked at me like she already knew how this conversation would end. Like she had rehearsed it. "You must be Ethan," she said. Voice smooth, almost kind. "If you didn't listen too closely, I'm so glad you finally came to see what we've done with the property," and I could taste the dust in the back of my throat as I forced the words out, "my property," but she just tilted her head, that smile tightening, and held out a folder thick with documents, paper that smelled fresh, expensive, official, legally transferred, she said, tapping the top page with a manicured nail. Everything was done by the book, and for a second, just 1 second, I felt it, that flicker of disbelief, like maybe the world had shifted while I was gone and nobody bothered to tell me, because I had been away, working contracts out of state, trusting that land to stay exactly where it had always been, rooted, untouchable. But as I flipped through those pages, signatures and stamps blurring together in the harsh Texas sunlight, something didn't sit right, something small, almost invisible, like a hairline crack running through glass, and Margaret kept talking, explaining, justifying, spinning it into something that sounded almost reasonable, but I wasn't listening anymore, because I'd seen it, one line buried deep in the original deed she thought nobody would ever read closely enough, one clause that didn't match the story she was selling, and that's when the noise of the construction faded, the laughter, the engines, all of it dropping into the background as a different kind of silence settled in, the kind that comes right before everything changes, and I closed the folder, handed it back to her without a word, and just nodded like I understood, like I accepted it, like I was already defeated, and she smiled wider, thinking she had won, thinking this was over, but what she didn't know was I wasn't there to argue, I wasn't there to fight, I was there to watch, because sometimes the smartest move you can make is to let them finish building exactly what you're about to take back. I grew up on that land before it had a name anyone else cared about, before there were streetlights or paved roads or property lines drawn for profit, back when it was just Carter land, 120 acres of rolling Texas soil that smelled like rain and diesel and hard work, and my grandfather used to say you could tell a man by how he treated his land because land remembers everything, every boot step, every fence post, every promise. And I believed that as a kid following him across those fields, my sneakers kicking up dust while he checked irrigation lines and ran his calloused hands over the earth like it was something alive, something that needed respect, and he built everything there himself piece by piece, the barn, the well system, even the old gravel driveway that used to crunch under tires like it had a voice, and my father kept it going after him, same routine, same early mornings. Same quiet pride in knowing that nothing we had was handed to us, it was earned, and when he passed, that land became more than property, it became the last physical thing tying 3 generations together, something you do not sell, something you protect, even if you have to step away for a while, which is exactly what I did when I took on a long-term engineering contract out of state, trusting that everything would still be there when I came back, because land like that does not just disappear, not legally. Not if the system works the way it is supposed to, but standing there now with fresh asphalt still radiating heat through the soles of my boots and the hum of air conditioning units replacing the wind that used to move through open pasture, I realized how wrong that assumption was, because someone had found a way to make it look legal, to wrap theft in paperwork and signatures and official stamps, and as I replayed Margaret's words in my head, that smooth confidence, that certainty that I would either not understand or not fight back, I started connecting pieces that did. not quite fit, like why the original survey markers were gone, why the creek had been redirected just enough to change the boundary lines on newer filings, why every document she showed me looked recent but referenced decisions that should have required my direct involvement, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this was not one move, this was a chain of moves, calculated, patient, built over time while I was not there to push back. And that realization should have made me angry, should have pushed me to react right then and there, to raise my voice, call a lawyer, make a scene in front of those perfect new houses, but instead it did the opposite, it slowed everything down, because if they had taken this much time to build their version of ownership, then rushing in without understanding every layer would only play into their hands, and I remembered something my grandfather used to say while fixing broken equipment, that the first problem you see is never the real problem, it is just the symptom of something deeper, and if you rush to fix the surface, you miss the system underneath. So I stood there a little longer, listening to the artificial quiet of a neighborhood that did not belong, watching sprinklers hiss across grass that had never grown naturally on that soil, and I made a decision that probably looked like surrender from the outside, because I turned around, got back in my truck, and drove away without another word, but in my head I was already mapping everything out, every record I would need, every timeline I would reconstruct, every detail they thought nobody would question, because if they believed the story was finished, that meant they would stop looking for threats. And that is exactly when you find the truth. That changes everything. The next morning the smell of burnt coffee filled my kitchen as I spread every document I still had across the table, the old deed my grandfather signed in 1978 sitting right in the center like it had been waiting for this moment, the paper worn at the edges but solid, real, nothing like the glossy packets Margaret handed me, and I ran my fingers over the embossed seal, feeling the texture, grounding myself in something that had not changed no matter what they built on top of it, and that is when I started noticing the difference, not in what her document said, but in what they carefully avoided saying, because every new filing referenced transfers, approvals, development rights, but none of them traced cleanly back to this original document, like a chain with one invisible link swapped out, and the more I followed it, the clearer it became that Margaret Holloway did not operate alone. She operated inside a system that let her move fast and stay unquestioned, a system built on people assuming everything had already been checked by someone else, and I had seen that kind of structure before in large projects, where responsibility gets diluted just enough that no single person stops the machine, and Margaret was the kind of person who thrived in that space, the kind who dressed authority in soft tones and polished appearances, who hosted community meetings with catered trays and friendly smiles while pushing through decisions buried under legal language nobody bothered to read, and I could picture it without even being there, her standing at the front of a room, one hand resting on a stack of documents, explaining how the land had been underutilized, how development would benefit the community, how everything was fully compliant, and people nodding because it sounded official, because it sounded finished, and because challenging someone like her meant stepping into a fight most people were not prepared for, especially when she had connections, the kind that made permits move faster and questions disappear quietly, and I remembered the way she looked at me, not nervous, not defensive, but certain, like she had already calculated every outcome and none of them included me winning, and that certainty told me more than anything else, because people who are bluffing leave cracks, but people who believe they are untouchable stop looking for threats altogether, and that is when I realized what my advantage actually was. It was not money, it was not influence, it was time, because while she had been building forward, adding layers of transactions and approvals, she had not gone backward, she had not expected anyone to go all the way back to the beginning and verify every assumption her entire structure depended on. And that meant somewhere in that foundation was a detail she overlooked, something small enough to ignore, but strong enough to collapse everything if pulled the right way. And as I sat there with the low hum of the refrigerator in the background and sunlight cutting across the table, I stopped thinking like someone who lost land and started thinking like an engineer again, breaking the system down into parts, mapping cause and effect, asking one simple question over and over, not how did she take it, but where did she never actually gain it, and the answer was there, buried in language most people would skip, a clause tied to the original ownership that limited how the land could be transferred under certain conditions, conditions that had never been properly satisfied, conditions that every single new document quietly ignored, and I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under my weight, feeling something settle into place, not anger, not even relief, just clarity, because for the first time since I saw that sign at the entrance, I understood exactly what I was looking at, not a loss, not even a fight, but a mistake waiting to be exposed, and the only thing left to decide was not if I could take it back, but when. I went back 3 days later just before sunset when the Texas heat starts to break and the light turns everything gold, the kind of light my grandfather used to call honest light because it shows every detail whether you like it or not, and Hollow Creek estates look different in that light, not like a finished neighborhood but like something rushed, something laid on top of something it did not fully understand, the fresh sod already drying at the edges, the paint still too bright, the streets too perfect, and I parked along the curb like I belonged there, like I was just another homeowner checking on his investment, because that was the part they did not question. Appearance, and as I stepped out the smell of sprinkler water hitting hot concrete rose into the air, sharp and artificial, nothing like the deep earthy scent that used to sit here after rain, and I walked slowly, not toward Margaret, not toward the entrance sign, but along the edges, where systems meet, where mistakes tend to hide, tracing the line where the new asphalt met the original gravel base I recognized immediately, because underneath everything they built, my land was still there. Unchanged, patient, and I watched how the drainage sloped, how the water lines had been rerouted, how the creek I grew up fishing in now curved unnaturally to fit their lot divisions, and that was the first visible confirmation that what I saw on paper was real in the ground too. They had reshaped just enough to make it look compliant without actually meeting the conditions required to transfer ownership properly, and as I kept walking, a couple stepped out of one of the houses, smiling. Relaxed, completely unaware, and for a moment I felt it again, that pull to stop this immediately, to tell them, to expose everything right there on the sidewalk, but I did not, because this was bigger than a conversation, bigger than one house or one sale. This was a system that needed to collapse all at once or it would simply adjust and survive, and halfway down the street I saw it, the small metal utility marker near the corner of a lot, half buried. Easy to miss unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, and I crouched down, brushing away the thin layer of dust, feeling the cool metal under my fingertips, and there it was, the original survey stamp, slightly bent but still readable, still tied to coordinates that predated every new document Margaret's team had filed, and I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the back of my mind telling me to always check the ground before trusting the paperwork, because the ground does not lie, and I stood back up, looking around at the quiet, well-kept street, at the identical mailboxes, the trimmed lawns, the illusion of permanence, and I realized just how fragile it all actually was, because every house here, every mortgage, every contract depended on a chain that had already been broken before the first foundation was poured, and the more they built, the more they locked themselves into that mistake, and that was when the weight of it shifted from loss to inevitability, because I was not standing in someone else's neighborhood anymore, I was standing in the middle of evidence, and they had given me something better than an argument, they had given me scale, dozens of properties tied to the same flaw, dozens of transactions that all leaned on the same missing requirement, and I knew in that moment this was no longer about getting my land back piece by piece. This was about letting the entire structure rise just high enough that when it finally came down, there would be no way to rebuild it on the same lie, and as the sun dipped lower and the streetlights flickered on one by one, I turned and walked back to my truck without rushing, without looking back, because the hardest part was not proving they were wrongs, it was making sure they could not escape it when the time came. The first thing I did was exactly what anyone would expect. I called a lawyer, a well-reviewed real estate attorney downtown with glass walls and framed degrees and that faint smell of polished wood and expensive coffee that tells you everything in the room costs more than it should, and I laid it all out, the deed, the surveys, the discrepancies, every detail I had pieced together, and he listened, nodding slowly, flipping through pages with careful hands, occasionally adjusting his glasses, like he was searching for something that would make it simpler. And when he finally leaned back in his chair, the silence stretched just long enough for me to know what was coming before he even said it. Even if you are right, he began, choosing his words like they might break if handled wrong. They have already built, they have already sold, there are multiple third-party buyers involved now, banks, title companies, insurance layers. This is not just a property dispute anymore, this is a system, and I could hear the unspoken part clearly. Systems like that do not get undone easily, not quickly, not without cost, and when I asked him what it would take, he did not hesitate. He gave me a number that sat heavy in the air between us, a number that assumed a long fight, years maybe, and even then no guarantees, just probabilities. And I nodded like I understood, because I did. He was not wrong. If I played this the way most people would, filing immediately, challenging each transaction as it came. I would be stepping into their timeline, reacting instead of controlling, and that was exactly where they had the advantage, because they had already moved everything forward, led protection over protection, buried the origin under complexity. And as I walked out of that office into the late afternoon heat, the city noise filling my ears, I realized something important. That first instinct to fight right away, to push back as hard as possible, that was not strategy, that was emotion, and emotion is predictable, easy to counter, easy to delay, and delay was their strongest tool, not mine. So I did something that felt wrong at first, something that went against every instinct I had been raised with. I did nothing, at least nothing visible. I did not file. I did not confront Margaret again. I did not warn anyone. Instead I went quiet, and in that quiet I started working differently, not like a victim trying to recover what was taken, but like someone building a case from the ground up, piece by piece. I requested public records, every filing tied to the development, every permit, every zoning adjustment. I mapped timelines across months, cross-referenced signatures, approvals, noticing patterns in how quickly certain things moved compared to how long they should have taken, and at night I sat at my kitchen table with the hum of the overhead light and stacks of paper spreading further each day, marking connections, circling inconsistencies, building something much larger than a simple claim, and slowly the picture sharpened, not just what they had done, but how they had relied on momentum, on the assumption that once enough houses were built and sold, the cost of undoing it would be too high for anyone to attempt, and that was their real strategy, not legality, but scale. And that was when the shift became complete, because I stopped thinking about stopping them and started thinking about letting them continue, letting them add more weight to the structure that was already unstable, letting them believe time was protecting them when in reality it was exposing more of the same flaw over and over again. And I could still hear that lawyer's voice in my head, talking about complexity, about systems, about difficulty, but what he did not see, what Margaret did not see, was that complexity does not protect a broken foundation, it amplifies it, and the bigger it gets, the harder it falls. And by the time I turned off the lights that night and the room went quiet except for the distant sound of wind brushing against the windows, I knew this was no longer about proving I owned the land. It was about proving they never had the right to take it in the first place, and that required patience, the kind that looks like surrender until the moment it changes everything. Weeks passed and Hollow Creek estates kept growing like nothing was wrong, new families moving in, moving trucks lining the streets, the low rumble of engines early in the morning blending with the rhythmic hiss of sprinklers that clicked on at exactly 6, and every time I drove by, I saw more proof of the same mistake repeating itself, another house sold, another deed recorded, another layer added to a structure that still traced back to that one broken clause, and I stayed invisible in all of it, just another truck passing through, just another face nobody bothered to remember, because people only watch for threats they expect, and I had already decided I would not be one of them. Instead I became something quieter, something harder to detect. I started pulling county records in bulk, not just my land but surrounding parcels, older transfers, neighboring easements, anything that connected to the original boundaries. And I spent hours in the records office where the air always smelled faintly of paper and dust, the kind of place where time slows down and details matter more than speed, flipping through archived plats, comparing coordinates, watching how the official lines had shifted just enough over the years to support what Margaret needed them to show, and it was subtle, almost impressive in a way, not one large change but a series of small adjustments that only made sense if you never traced them all the way back, and that was the pattern. Everything relied on people stopping halfway, trusting the most recent version without questioning the origin, and the deeper I went, the more consistent that pattern became. Approvals that referenced earlier approvals that were never independently verified, signatures that appeared in the right places but under timelines that did not align with when decisions should have been made, and every time I thought I had reached the limit of it, another layer appeared, another document that looked valid on its own but depended entirely on the same flawed assumption, and at night I transferred everything into a system of my own, building a full map across my kitchen table again, lines connecting documents, dates, properties, until it stopped looking like a single dispute and started looking like a network. And that was when I realized the real scale of what they had done, because this was not just my land anymore, this was dozens of transactions tied to the same missing requirement, dozens of homeowners whose titles depended on a chain that had never been legally secured at the source, and that realization changed the way I approached everything, because now it was not just about proving my ownership, it was about proving the Invalidity of everything built on top of it, and that required precision, not speed, because if I moved too early, they could isolate the issue, contain it, adjust around it, but if I waited until enough of those transactions stacked up, until enough parties were tied into the same flaw, then it would not be something they could quietly fix, it would be something they could not ignore at all. And one afternoon, sitting in my truck at the edge of the development with the engine off and the distant sound of lawnmowers drifting through the open window, I watched a real estate agent hand keys to a new homeowner, smiles, handshakes, cameras out, another sale completed, and I felt the shift locking completely, because that moment, that routine transaction they celebrated, it was not just another step forward for them, it was another piece of evidence for me, another confirmation that they were still building on the same foundation they never actually owned, and I leaned back in the seat, the heat pressing against the glass, and let the moment pass without moving, because the hardest part was not uncovering the truth anymore, it was letting them keep proving it for me until there was no way out. It happened in a place most people would never think to look, not in the polished reports or the neatly stamped approvals, but buried inside an archived filing that smelled like dust and time, the kind of document that had not been touched in years because everyone assumed it had already done its job, and I only found it because I stopped following their path forward and started tracing everything backward, step by step, all the way to the earliest recorded boundary adjustment tied to my land. And there it was, a small amendment filed years before Margaret ever stepped into power, one that redefined how access rights and water distribution were legally attached to the property, and on its own it looked harmless, routine even, but paired with the original deed my grandfather signed, it created a condition that could not be bypassed, a condition that required direct acknowledgement and reauthorization from the primary title holder before any subdivision or transfer could be considered valid, and that acknowledgement had never happened, not once, not in any of the documents I had pulled, not in any timeline they built their entire development on, and I sat there staring at that page, the quiet hum of the records room filling the space around me, realizing that everything they had done depended on people never connecting these two documents together, because individually they looked complete, but together they exposed the gap, the one place where ownership never legally changed hands, and for a moment I just let that sink in, because this was not a minor discrepancy, this was the foundation itself, the one thing no amount of later paperwork could fix retroactively, and I could feel the weight of it shifting again, from theory to certainty, from possibility to inevitability, because now I was not just seeing a pattern, I had the point of failure, the exact place where their entire claim stopped being valid, and the more I reviewed everything with that lens, the clearer it became that every single sale inside Hollow Creek Estates referenced a chain that passed through that exact moment without ever satisfying the requirement, meaning every new owner, every bank, every title insurer had unknowingly anchored themselves to something that was never legally secured, and I leaned back in the chair, the metal frame creaking softly, and looked around the room, rows of shelves filled with documents that most people would never read twice, realizing how easily something like this could be overlooked when everyone assumed someone else already checked it, and that was the real flaw they built on, not just in paperwork but in human behavior, and I thought about Margaret again, the way she carried herself, the confidence, the control, and I understood now that her strength came from momentum, from moving fast enough that no one had time to question the origin, but momentum does not hold up when the starting point is wrong, and that was when the plan fully locked into place, not to interrupt, not to expose it piece by piece, but to wait until enough depended on that flaw that pulling it would not just stop one transaction, it would force every single one of them to be re-evaluated at once, and as I carefully placed that document back into its folder, the paper sliding softly against paper, I felt something settle that had not been there before, not just confidence, but control, because for the first time since I stepped back onto that land, I was no longer reacting to what they had done, I was deciding when it would all come apart, and they had no idea it had already begun. Once I knew exactly where the break was, everything I did after that became deliberate, controlled, almost quiet in a way that felt strange compared to how most people would fight something like this, because I was no longer searching for answers, I was building proof, and proof requires structure, so I went back through every single transaction tied to that development and rebuilt the chain the way it should have existed, not the way they presented it, laying each document out across my table. Again, the faint smell of paper and ink mixing with the stale air of late nights, tracing ownership from my grandfather's original deed forward, step by step, marking the exact point where legal authority should have transferred but never did. and then following how every new deed ignored that gap and simply assumed continuity, and what stood out was not just the error itself, but how consistently it had been repeated, like a template copied over and over again without anyone stopping to verify the source, and that was where the real leverage started to form, because it meant this was not isolated, this was systemic, and systemic problems do not get dismissed. They get escalated, especially when they affect multiple parties who all believe they are protected, and I started organizing everything into a timeline that could not be misunderstood, dates aligned, signatures compared, approvals placed exactly where they belonged instead of where they had been claimed, and I added context where it mattered, zoning changes that moved too quickly, filings that referenced decisions made before they were legally authorized, small inconsistencies that on their own might be ignored but together created a pattern that could not be explained away. And as that timeline grew, it stopped looking like paperwork and started looking like a story, one that showed exactly how control of that land was never properly established before it was divided and sold, and that was the key, not just showing that something was wrong, but showing when it went wrong and how everything after depended on that moment, and I could feel the weight of it each time I added another document to the sequence. Each time a new connection confirmed what I already knew, because this was no longer about my claim versus theirs, this was about whether the entire chain of ownership held up under scrutiny, and I knew it did not, and I knew that once it was examined the right way, it would not matter how many houses had been built or how many families had moved in, because legality does not scale with construction, it either exists or it does not. And one night as I sat there reviewing the full map again, the lines, the notes, the documents stacked in precise order, I realized I had everything I needed, not just to challenge them, but to force the entire situation into a place where it had to be addressed at once, and that was when the final piece of the approach became clear, because exposing this quietly would not work, it had to be done in a way that pulled every affected party into the same moment, the same question, the same realization, and I leaned back, the chair shifting slightly under me, the room silent except for the low hum of electricity in the walls, and I understood that the next step was not about gathering more evidence, it was about choosing the exact moment to use it, the point where there would be no way for them to separate themselves from the flaw they had built everything on. And once that moment came, there would be no negotiation, no adjustment, no quiet fix, just one question that would echo through every document they had signed, who actually owned the land from the beginning, and for the first time since this started, I was not thinking about what they had taken, I was thinking about how everything they built was about to come back to me all at once. The moment I understood I could not do this alone was not dramatic, it was quiet, sitting at my kitchen table with everything laid out in front of me and realizing that what I had built was solid but it needed weight behind it, the kind of weight that turns evidence into action, and that is when I reached out to someone my grandfather trusted years ago, a surveyor named Daniel Reeves who had worked the original boundaries of our land long before any of this development existed, and when he opened the door to his office, the smell of old maps and drafting ink hit me immediately, the walls lined with rolled blueprints and framed plats that looked like history frozen in paper, and I could see the moment he recognized the Carter name, a slight pause, a shift in his posture, because names like that carry stories in places like this, and I did not waste time explaining everything at once. I just handed him the original deed and the amended filing I had found, watched as his eyes moved across the lines, slower and slower as the pieces connected in his head, and when he finally looked up, there was no confusion, no hesitation, just a quiet understanding that something had been done wrong, not in a small way, but in a way that should never have passed unnoticed, and over the next few hours we went through everything together, cross-checking coordinates, verifying the original survey markers, confirming that the physical land still aligned with what my document showed, and that was important because it anchored everything in reality, not just theory, and Daniel pointed out something that made the whole situation even clearer, that the adjustments made to the creek and boundary lines were cosmetic at best, they changed how the land looked on newer maps but did not legally redefine the original survey without proper authorization, which had never been granted, and hearing that from someone who had worked those lines decades ago added a layer my documents alone could not provide, credibility tied to history, and that was when I understood what a real alliance looked like in something like this, not people fighting for me, but people confirming the truth from angles that could not be dismissed, and Daniel was not the only one. Over the next week I connected with a title analyst named Rebecca Lawson who specialized in tracing complex ownership chains, and her office was the opposite of Daniel's, clean, digital, screens filled with layered data instead of paper, but the reaction was the same, that moment where everything clicked and the flaw became obvious once you knew where to look, and she helped me structure the chain in a way that could be presented clearly, not just as a collection of issues but as a single continuous failure point, and between the three of us, the physical land, the historical survey, and the legal chain all aligned to the same conclusion. And that alignment was what turned this from a personal claim into something much larger, something that could not be brushed aside as a misunderstanding or a technicality. And as I stood outside Rebecca's office that evening, the city air cooler now, the sound of traffic steady in the background, I realized that the quiet phase was over, because once you have proof that holds from every angle, the only thing left is deciding how and when to bring it into the light, and this was no longer about whether I could take my land back. It was about making sure that when I did, there would be no argument left standing against it. The plan did not begin with a confrontation, it began with timing, because once everything was aligned, once the land, the records, and the chain of ownership all pointed to the same truth, the only thing that mattered was when to apply pressure, and I chose a moment that would force every piece of their system into the same room, because separate problems can be managed, but a single unified question cannot be ignored, and that is when I made the decision to step directly into their structure instead of staying outside it. I purchased one of the homes inside Hollow Creek Estates, a quiet closing handled like any other, papers signed, keys handed over, no suspicion, because to them I was just another buyer entering the system they believed was secure, and the moment that transaction was complete, everything shifted, because now I was not just the original owner of the land, I was also part of the very development built on top of it, and that gave me access, not just physical access but legal standing inside their framework, and I attended my first homeowners association meeting a week later, sitting in a room that smelled faintly of fresh paint and brewed coffee, listening. As Margaret stood at the front, confident as ever, reviewing budgets, maintenance plans, speaking in that same controlled tone that made everything sound orderly and final, and nobody questioned her, nobody challenged the structure she had built, because from the inside it looked complete, it felt legitimate, and that was exactly what I needed. Confirmation that the system was stable enough to hold its shape right up until the moment it was not, and I watched carefully, noting how decisions were documented, how records were maintained, how communication flowed between the board, the residents, and the external parties like banks and title companies, because every connection mattered now, every pathway that tied back to the same flawed foundation, and over the next few weeks I positioned everything quietly, coordinating with Daniel and Rebecca, aligning our documentation so that when it was presented, it would not just question one transaction, it would challenge the entire chain simultaneously, and I made sure every affected party would be pulled into that moment, because the strength of what I had built was not in any single document, it was in how all of them connected to the same missing requirement. And one evening, sitting alone in my new living room with the faint hum of air conditioning filling the space and the glow of streetlights filtering through the window, I laid out the final sequence in my mind, not as a reaction but as an execution, a controlled release of everything I had uncovered, timed so that it could not be isolated or dismissed, and for the first time since this began, I could see the entire path clearly, from the moment my grandfather signed that original deed to the moment every single transaction built on top of it would be questioned in one place, at one time. And I understood then that this was no longer about taking back land quietly or negotiating behind closed doors. This was about forcing the truth into the open in a way that would hold under scrutiny from every angle. And as I sat there in a house that technically belonged to me twice over, once as the original owner and once as a buyer within their system, I realized that the structure they built to protect themselves had become the very thing that would expose them, and all that remained was to set it in motion. The courtroom did not feel dramatic at first, it felt controlled, almost quiet in a way that made every sound stand out, the soft shuffle of papers, the low hum of air conditioning, the faint echo of footsteps against polished floors, and I sat there at the table with everything we had built laid out in front of me, every document, every timeline, every connection aligned exactly the way it needed to be, while across the room Margaret Holloway carried that same confidence I had seen from the beginning, posture straight, expression calm, like this was just another situation she would manage the way she always had, through presentation, through control, through the assumption that complexity would protect her, and for a moment it almost looked like it might, because her legal team moved first, presenting their chain of transactions, each one clean on its own, each one supported by signatures, approvals, the kind of structure that usually holds up when examined piece by piece, and I watched as they walked the court through their version of ownership, step by step, building a narrative that felt complete if you never questioned where it started, and that was exactly the point where everything changed, because when it was our turn, we did not challenge their steps individually, we did not argue about specific transactions or isolated approvals, we went straight to the beginning, and as I stood there with the original deed in my hands, the paper steady, the weight of it grounding everything that came next, the room shifted in a way you could feel more than hear, because this was no longer about interpretation, it was about origin, and we laid it out clearly, the original ownership, the amendment that created the condition they never satisfied, the exact moment where authority should have been confirmed and was not, and then we connected it forward, not as separate issues but as a single continuous failure that every one of their transactions depended on, and I could see it happen in real time, the way the narrative they built started to lose its shape, because once the foundation is questioned, everything above it stops being secure, and the judge leaned forward slightly, reviewing the documents, asking questions that cut directly into the gap we had identified. Not broad questions, precise ones, about authorization, about continuity, about whether the original requirement had ever been fulfilled, and there was a pause then, not long, but long enough, because there is a difference between answering confidently and realizing there is no answer that fixes the problem, and that was the moment Margaret's certainty cracked, not outwardly, not in a way most people would notice, but in a small shift of her focus, the way her attention moved from controlling the room to reacting to it, and we did not rush, we did not press harder than necessary, because the strength of what we had did not require force, it required clarity, and as the full chain was presented, from the original deed to the most recent sale inside that development, it became impossible to separate any part of it from that missing requirement, impossible to argue that later transactions could override something that had never been legally established in the first place. And I remember standing there, listening to the quiet that settled over the room as everything connected, realizing that this was the exact moment I had been working toward from the start, not a confrontation, not a reaction, but a point where the truth stood on its own and left no room for anything else, and for the first time since I stepped back onto that land, I knew it was no longer a question of if it would be taken back, but how far that decision would reach. The sound of the judge's gavel was not loud, but it carried through the room like a line being drawn that could not be erased, and for a second everything felt still, like the air itself had paused to catch up with what had just been decided, because once the ruling was spoken, it did not come in pieces, it came as a single, unavoidable conclusion. The original transfer of ownership had never been legally completed, which meant every transaction that followed was built on something that did not exist in the way it was claimed, and you could feel the shift ripple outward, not just in that courtroom but beyond it, into every contract, every mortgage, every title tied to that development, and I stayed where I was, hands resting on the table, listening as the details were clarified, the language precise, structured, leaving no room for interpretation, because this was not about intent or presentation anymore, it was about legality, and legality does not bend to convenience, and across the room Margaret did not speak, she did not need to, because the system she relied on had already answered for her, and it had not held, and as the proceedings moved forward, the implications started to unfold, not all at once but in layers, because undoing something like this is not a single action, it is a process, one that touches every party connected to it, and I could see it in the way people reacted. The quiet exchanges between attorneys, the notes being taken faster now, the realization that this was no longer contained to one dispute, and that was exactly what I had prepared for, because the strength of what we presented was not just in proving ownership, it was in showing that the flaw could not be isolated, it could not be corrected without addressing everything that depended on it, and that meant the development itself, every parcel, every recorded deed, all of it had to be re-evaluated under the same standard. And as the courtroom slowly returned to motion, I gathered my documents, the same papers that had once felt like fragments now forming a complete, undeniable structure, and walked out into the late afternoon light, the warmth hitting my face as the door closed behind me, and for the first time since I saw that sign at the entrance, the weight I had been carrying shifted into something else, not relief, not even satisfaction, but resolution, because what had been uncertain was now settled, not by argument, not by pressure, but by the truth holding exactly where it needed to, and later that evening, as I drove past the entrance again, the same stone sign standing in place, the same houses lining the streets. Everything looked unchanged on the surface, but I knew what had already begun beneath it. The legal process that would unwind everything step by step, the notifications, the reviews, the corrections that would have to follow, and I slowed the truck just enough to take it in, the quiet hum of engines in the distance, the soft glow of porch lights coming on one by one, and I realized that what had been built there was never truly stable, it just had not been tested yet, and now that it had, there was no way for it to remain the same. Because once the foundation is proven invalid, everything above it has to answer to that truth, and I rested my hand on the steering wheel, the leather warm under my fingers, and let that thought settle in fully, because this was not the end of the story, it was the moment everything started to return to where it should have been all along. Weeks later the sound that stayed with me was not construction anymore but wind, moving across open space where it used to get trapped between identical rooftops, and I stood at the edge of the property just before sunrise, boots pressing into soil that had not changed no matter what had been built on top of it, the air cool, carrying that same quiet scent of earth and grass I remembered from years ago, and behind me the development was still there, houses, streets, everything intact for now. But no longer untouchable, no longer protected by the illusion that paperwork alone could define reality, because the process had already begun, notices filed, reviews initiated, every transaction being pulled back into question one by one, not with chaos but with precision, the same way it had all been built, only now in reverse, and I watched as a survey team worked near the far boundary, measuring, marking, restoring lines that had always existed but had been ignored. And it struck me how little had actually changed in the ground itself, how everything that mattered had been there the whole time waiting to be recognized again, and I thought about Margaret, about the confidence she carried, the certainty that systems like hers could not be challenged once they reached a certain scale, and in a way she was right, most people would have stopped, would have accepted the cost, the complexity, the idea that it was too big to fix. But she made one mistake, she assumed the foundation did not matter anymore once enough had been built on top of it, and that is not how any system works, not in engineering, not in law, not in anything that is meant to last, because the moment the base fails, everything above it becomes temporary, no matter how complete it looks, and I walked a little further out, past where the old fence line used to run, the faint imprint still visible if you knew where to look, and I could almost hear my grandfather again, that steady voice reminding me that land does not forget, it just waits for someone to pay attention, and I realized then that this was never about taking something back in the way people usually think, it was about restoring what had never actually been transferred, correcting a story that had been told wrong from the start, and as the sun began to rise, light spreading across the property, touching both the open ground and the houses that now stood on it, I felt that same clarity settle in one last time. Because everything had come full circle, from the moment I first saw that sign to this quiet morning where the truth no longer needed to be proven, it simply existed, and I turned back toward the road, the gravel crunching under my steps, steady, familiar, and I understood something my grandfather never had to explain out loud, that justice does not arrive all at once, it builds, patiently, quietly, until there is nothing left that can stand against it, and when it finally does, it does not need to be loud, it just needs to be undeniable.